Hello, edition of the Tech live stream, no frills cast, just a lap. Tech Guy, half fedora, season 18 Doctor Who's going to be probably on the road on Friday. Not definite, but probably so may pre-record next week's podcast. Not positive yet. Normally, actually the plan had been to broadcast live from Pinball Festival that I cover every year, but that Pinball Festival was canceled. So I'm going to be off my son traveling most likely that day. Not definitely, but the podcast may or may not be live streamed, or it may just be a recorded podcast. I wanted to FYI you on that today, so it's not a surprise if it happens next week. All right. Well, and the main thing to talk about is how we seem to be growing 1,000 Joseph Stalins. It seems to be Stalin everywhere. And it amazes me that we are at a point where we're at 1,000 Stalins blooming, that we have Stalins everywhere. And it took so little time for us to reach that point. But the reality is it didn't take all that much time. I mean, it did take a lot of time. It took years. It took years of the left taking over cultural institutions. It took years of our enemies paying for the best teachers that their money could buy. It took years of indoctrinating students. It took years of retreat for us to reach the point we're at today. And the people who are wondering, boy, this happened so suddenly. Suddenly, I mean, it's like, I can't believe all this is happening. I mean, Stephen did a rant about it being table throwing time. My own suggestion is a little more modest, but the point is it hasn't been happening slowly. In his very last speech that I covered live, Andrew Breitbart was in Lexington, Massachusetts, and talked about this stuff, talked about what the left was doing, talked about what they were doing to the institutions, talked about going in. Now, he didn't talk about foreign money, which we're seeing more and more revelations of foreign money in the schools and in the colleges and so forth. He didn't talk about the attempts to censor people like legal insurrection. He didn't talk about all of this stuff. He talked about how it was coming and what was being done to try and make it happen. And now we have the attacks on police. Stephen Crowder in his rant talked about a police officer being charged with murder in the situation in Atlanta, when you had a guy who had literally pointed out their deadly weapon in the hand of a police officer, but as long as the demonization of police really gets me. And one of the reasons why it gets me is be very deep in one respect. I've been reading a series of books called American Told by Contemporaries. It was written by a historian by the name of Albert Bushnell Harden, 5 volumes between the 1880s and 1934, I think was the last volume he wrote. And he was a very famous historian out of Harvard College, was there for decades teaching history. Was actually involved in teaching William Du Bois and getting Du Bois's doctrine. And what this book is, and it's spectacular books. You should find them if you can find them. Was basically, instead of writing history, he took took letters and documents from that and basically let the documents pay for himself. Here's what this person said. Here are his known prejudices. Here's this subject. And rather than trying to write history, and he wrote plenty of history over the course of the years, he used the documents that were actually letters, court cases, etc., and let them speak for themselves. And I've been reading a lot of this stuff. And right now, I'm actually on around 1820. Jefferson writing about the Missouri Compromise and so forth. And I'm reading what these people went through just to live and just to do things that we take for granted today. And I am thoroughly convinced that Evan Sayet was right about the Kindergarten of Eden, that one of the reasons why people are falling for so much of this stuff is that, or I should say some people are falling, don't never had a situation where they actually where they did not have to worry about their lives in the same way. And because of that, when people have never actually experienced actual oppression, anything can be sold as oppression. And let me tell you something, if you're going to a $70,000 a year college, you are not, by definition, you are not oppressed. By definition, you're not only in the top 1% of the world, but you are in the top 1% of the world all time, since the beginning of time. That's just the way it is. So if you're at a $70,000 a year college, don't try and sell me that you're oppressed. And we've seen people talk about, oh, I'm triggered by this speaker. I'm triggered by this. I'm triggered by that. And we put up with it. We did not put these people in their place. We did not call them out for the stupidity that they were advancing. We did not say, no, you're not. We didn't deny it. And I'm reminded of a moment back when I first started doing reporting during the Scott Brown campaign. I was actually on the very first podcast I was ever on. I was on with Ali Alexander, and he was working for the Brown campaign at the time. And he said, well, we have to stop Obamacare. Because remember, Scott Brown was going to be the 60th vote. This is why the House version of Obamacare got passed. And Ali's over there, but it's it. We're going to repeal it. And I just bluntly said, no, you're not. Ali immediately changed the subject. Not because of what I had just said was false, but because once you pass a law like that, it's incredibly hard to repeal it. And he knew that, and that's why he changed the subject. And that's what the left does. We are letting Chicken Little, people who have no tolerance for reality, dictate how we live. And that's a real amazing thing. It's like watching Munich. It's like watching the seizure of the Rhineland in real time, where the Nazis were sending in their bikes, but they had orders to retreat. And of course, the French didn't resist, so they just grabbed it and remilitarized. And people are giving in to thugs. Thugs pulling down statues, thugs burning, thugs looting, thugs taking over parts of cities. People are just giving in. And what's amazing is so many of the little Stalins on the left are going along with it because they think it will help beat Donald Trump. It's all about the power. It's been all about the power for quite a while. And the fact that these people are putting themselves at risk eventually, and that's what basically what's happening, is they're putting themselves at risk, because every Stalinist movement ends up turning on its own people if they become impure in any way, in any reason. But the question becomes really what was said by Stephen Crowder. What do we do? Well, I was looking at this. I've been looking at this for days, and it's been bothering me. I mean, I had a rough time. I'd been under quarantine for a while. Then my son got sick for 3 weeks. 3 weeks with a temperature over 100. And then there was the march in Fitchburg, and we didn't know what was going to happen. And so I was worrying about that and worrying about defending my house. And then I'm thinking, someone's got to do something. Someone's got to do something. And that was the wrong way to think. And if you're watching this podcast, and if you're thinking someone's got to do something, that's the wrong answer. It's not someone who has to do something. You have to do something. We cannot say, I mean, it's nice to have a podcast. It's nice to use a hashtag. But that's not going to change anything. That's not going to bring up the morale of the police. That's not going to solve the problem. So I decided to do something. And this is what I did. 2 days ago, Wednesday afternoon, actually, on my way to work, I left a little early. I swung by Ocean State Job Lot, which is near the highway where I have to take to work. And I went over and I bought a folding chair, and I bought some magic markers. I also bought some chocolates for some ladies at work who found my keys when I lost. And I bought some paper like this. Now, they unfortunately was on sale, so they only had some beaten up ones, but I bought them anyways. Didn't have time to shop for anything else. Threw them in the car, went to work. I worked till midnight, got out of work. I got home. This is the sign I made. Nothing fancy. Just support local police. Since I live in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, on the other side I put support your local Fitchburg police. I actually did that because I had the spacing wrong on that side, so I had to figure out how to make it work. But again, nothing fancy. And then Thursday morning, before I went to work, I got up early, and I went to the intersection of Putnam Street and Main Street in Fitchburg, which is a one-way at the moment. They're thinking of changing, which is a bad idea, but that's a topic that has no interest to you. And I put out my folding chair. I took out my rosary, and I sat there for an hour holding that sign as cars went by. Now, there was not a big fuss. There was not hundreds of people marching. I didn't put out notices on Facebook. First of all, I don't do Facebook. I didn't put notices out on Twitter that I was going to do this. I didn't make a big deal out of it. Lots of cars went by, and some people walked by. People who walked by expressed that they agreed with the sentiment. The officer pulled aside, rolled down his window. Thank you. That made the day. Because people do not understand what police, how do I say this? One of my favorite sayings is that the easiest job in the world is the job that someone else is doing. The easiest job to do is one someone else is doing, because, and you've seen that with work. You've seen it. People are always saying, oh, he should have done this way. He should have done this that way. People always think they know best on how to do someone else's job. Well, let me go over a little bit what a police officer's job is. Now, the job of a police officer is pretty basic in that it's to answer. You will run into the police when one of these things happen. When someone's doing something bad. Doesn't have to be very bad. Could be a traffic issue. Could be a fight. Someone's doing something bad. That's when police show up. Or someone's angry about what someone else is doing. Maybe there's a fight outside. I mean, the last time I had to call the police, there were people with guns outside my house. That was before I grabbed my camera and went out the back door and started filming. My wife still hasn't forgiven me for that. Or sometimes you're complaining about loud music or whatever. I don't bother about loud music myself. But someone complaining about it, or someone's angry at someone's doing, and they'll call the police. I mean, we've even had the spectacle this week about a person trying to buy crack. And the person took their money and didn't give them the crack, and they called the police because the guy cheated them out of she wanted her $20 back because she didn't get her crack, which was very funny. Another one actually called the police because they wanted to loot a building, and the armed person at the door wouldn't let them. So they called the cops. Very funny. Third time the police show up is when someone is in trouble or when someone's scared. Scared for their life, scared for their family. Something's wrong. Domestic disputes are a great example. And the fourth time, generally, is when someone's either just had, or is in the midst of an accident or crisis. People will call, if there's a car accident, if there's something dangerous going on, police will get called. So those are examples that you could bring up if you wanted to. But the point I'm making here is that police officers are called at times of maximum tension. People don't call police officers just to chat. They call the police at a time when when they're tense about something, when something is going wrong. They are called at times of tension. And so the adrenaline is going on. People are nervous. People are fidgety. People are upset. I'm going to retweet the podcast. If you'll give me a moment before I continue. Let me put down the mic. I'll try and speak a little louder. I'll actually tilt it towards here. Say times of. Let's see. Let me put that over here. Again, I'm sorry to interrupt the podcast that way, but the point of the podcast is to get people to watch. So if I can get people to watch. Let's see, we'll put a couple of tags on that. Tweet that out again. All right, maybe we'll get a couple, maybe we won't. So, anyways, so it's maximum. So it's a time of stress. And what are police officers expected to do at that time of stress? Police officers are expected to diffuse a situation with the appropriate amount of force, with the word appropriate to be defined after the fact. Now remember, any kind of routine traffic stop or any visit to a domestic or any time police are called, they can become life or death without warning. Great example is what happened in Atlanta. The guy's trying to talk his way out of getting in trouble because he knows, while the officers don't at this time, he's on probation, and that if he's pinched, goes back to jail because of the offenses he'd already been given probation on. Now think about this. If the guy had not been given probation, if he had just been sentenced, he'd be alive today. But that's another consideration. So, sometimes mercy, you think you're giving someone mercy, but you're actually not, because you're putting them in a situation where now it's time to do something. They're doing something desperate. And the other thing about this is they are expected to keep their cool and stand there. If people are berating them or disparaging them, I mean, how many times have you seen during protests the lines of police? And that's the phone. My wife can answer that. How many times have we seen lines of police and people throwing rocks and bottles and saying all kinds of things about them, and police holding their ground? That's what they got to do. That's what they're expected to do. Could you do that? Would you be able to do that? And remember, all those times those things are happening, those provocations are happening, there's always a camera phone these days. 1 foot wrong, police officers, in trouble. At the very least, they could, or fired, or charged, and like this guy who's now ridiculously being charged with. All of those things can happen. And police, that's the daily life of a police officer. I couldn't do it. And I suspect most of the people bringing in money from the Black Lives Matter movement couldn't do it either. But the problem is we have ceded the public argument. We are not public. I can make a hashtag on Twitter. I can do this podcast. But that's not the public argument. The average person is not going to see that. We'll see someone sitting with the sign. Now, I'm not going to pretend that one guy sitting on a corner for an hour with this sign is going to make a huge difference. But that one cop who said thank you, it meant something to him. He might even mention it to someone else at the department. It might mean something. Now, there are cities and towns in Massachusetts. Imagine if in every one of those cities and towns, One person decided to make a sign and sit on any corner, just long enough to be seen for that hour. Imagine people across the country getting out there and saying, I am going to put up my sign that says, support the local police. I'm going to sit on a corner for an hour, and I'm just going to hold my sign and I'm going to leave. Don't have to engage people if you don't want to. People say, what do you mean by that? It means exactly what it says. Support our local police. It means you don't believe in black lives. Doesn't say that. It just says support my local police. You think it's all right for police to kill? Doesn't say that. It just says support my local police. That's what it's. You don't have to say anything more. People do not, and this is something people forget on Twitter. No one is entitled to a response if you don't want to give one. The freedom to speak is also the freedom not to speak. And that's something that the left is trying to take away. The freedom to speak or the freedom not to speak. But the point is, you have to be willing to go out there. Even something a little like a little sign and a little chair. Now there's always a chance. There's always some risk. But the first virtue above all others is courage. No other virtue survives without courage. They say that the Second Amendment is the thing that keeps the first happening. Courage is the thing that keeps it first. Without courage, nothing. If you do not have the courage to stand up for your stuff, it wouldn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're armed. You can buy a gun, but if you keep it locked up and when the barbarians are coming, it doesn't matter. You can tweet if you are unwilling to risk other people saying, "You think that? Who are you to say something like that?" Well, the proper answer is, who do I have to be? Who made you the arbiter of what I can say? These people have to be stood up to. These people have to be rejected. And the police need to be supported. And they need to see someone supporting them. I tweeted about this. And Sissy Willis, who used to blog and was a great blogger, she doesn't blog anymore. She mentioned after seeing that, she was going on an errand. And she was passing by a police area. And in Massachusetts is the only state where we don't have flagmen. We have by law, police have to handle that. And now that's a question that it's a fair question. That's an awful lot more expense. And that's a totally separate debate. Whether or not we should be allowed to just have flagmen instead of police in those stops. But she saw a policeman at a traffic thing like that. Pulled over, said something nice to him about that. Police officer thanked her. And when she was coming back, they recognized her car and gave a thumbs up. Made that officer's day. At a time when everyone is trying to act as though they're garbage. They're not garbage. They're men and women who are doing something that saves us the trouble of doing it. Because the police and the National Guard were deployed a few weeks ago in Fitchburg and ready to move, my plans for defending my house and my neighborhood didn't have to go into action. Because of that, a person I know didn't have to have a shotgun ready. But remember, it's not just the right that has to worry about this. It's the left. What happens if there's no... you have people doing cancel culture, people harassing people in restaurants. What happens when a guy decides, you know what? There's not going to be a cop coming. Now I can beat your ass. Or now I can produce my gun. And what happens with an extremist? We're worried about the leftist extremists, and that's true. But there are some extremists on the right. If you don't believe me, there's an abortionist named Tiller who got himself shot in his own church. The difference, of course, being we universally condemn that, but the left universally make for the extremists. Extremists on the right are rejected. Extremists on the left are celebrated and excused, which is the big difference. But what happens to the people like the guy? I think it was Scott Roeder was his name. What happens when there's no police? You think the next Scott Roeder, if there was no police, is going to worry about hitting a hood? You think the next guy who wants to do a bombing is going to worry about that? If there's, and remember, no police also means if a judge makes a judgment, you have, this person, who's going to enforce it? Andrew Jackson famously said after the ruling in favor of the Cherokee, Judge Marshall made that ruling, let him enforce it. Without the police, without marshals enforcing laws, the only law is who has the biggest gun and who has the guts to use it. That's the reality. The police make it possible for us to have civilization without have to being on our guard for our life every moment of our lives. That's huge. And to illustrate this, I did, and I've mentioned this before, I did a series of interviews called Interviews with Immigrants. And one of the interviews I did was a woman named Maria from the Dominican Republic. And I did it through a translator because she spoke almost no English and I don't speak Spanish. And one of the things I noticed about Maria and her friends, because I'd worked with her, is that they would come back from lunch breaks and you would have 3 or 4 women standing abreast and they would have their arms locked with each other. And I thought, oh, that's a strange custom. That's cultural. I said, I wonder why they do it. And I had some ideas in my head, but I didn't go into it. Well, Maria said, I asked her during the interview, and you can find the interview on YouTube, when she decided she wanted to live in America. And she said when she visited her sister in Leominster, which is the town next to this one, and she had went by a lake and sat down, was alone. And there were 3 men who came by, strangers. She didn't know who they were. And as they were walking by, it suddenly hit her that she wasn't afraid. And if she had been at home, she'd be very afraid. And I found out the reason why they locked arms like that is that used to be for protection. You can't just grab a woman that way. If their arms locked, it's much harder. And that's when she decided, I want to live in America. But this didn't happen generically. It happened over time that America reached that point. And as I said, I'm reading those books, and these are times when if you were on the frontier, it was life or death every day. There was a war with England. If you were on the seas, piracy was still going on. It was life or death. If you had a lot of professions, well, life and death. Death was common. It was in our faces every day. And people lived through it. The fact that we don't have to do that is because we have a strong police force. They allow us the luxury of civilization. John Adams once said, I have to study war and politics. My sons can study mathematics, and my grandsons can study poetry and so forth. I don't have the exact quote with me. But that's what allows civilization. That's why so many people come here. But because we have people who don't understand, because it's been around them all their lives, they don't know what they're losing. They don't know what they're throwing away. And they have professors who either know and are being paid otherwise, or who are looking for the revolution. They want to see feudalism because they see themselves as the lords. They want to see communism and Marxism because they see themselves as the chairman who will be ruling over. So I say stand up, make sit on a corner for an hour. Do it. Just have to do it once. Let people physically see that there are people willing to stand up. Because although fear is contagious, courage is contagious too. Courage is very contagious. When people see you showing courage, they get the courage to stand up. And that's why it's important. And again, to give you an example, I'm going to switch now. To give an example of how this works in other situations. Let's talk Colin Kaepernick. Now, you'll remember the NFL kneeling drama we talked about a while back on the blog. That's DaTechGuyblog.com, by the way, for those of you who don't know. And how I think that, again, Goodell is misreading the fan base who pays for the foot. And I think the NFL players don't understand what they're doing to themselves. But I think more importantly is this. People are forgetting one other consideration. As Goodell says, I want someone to sign Kaepernick. And there may be football reasons to sign him. Like I said, he's gone several years without being hit by a 300-pound body, which has a great healing people. Not being hit by 300-pound men really does wonders for your body's ability to heal. And because, he's been to a Super Bowl, so he has experience. I mean, you could make a case for him versus somebody else. But there's one other consideration about the signing of Kaepernick. If I was a last place team, I'd sign him. I'd go 16-0. And you know why I'd go 16-0? I'd have him run the ball every play. I wouldn't have a running back. I'd either have Kaepernick run it or throw it on every play. Because now you're a defensive player. You're going after the quarterback. Let's say the coverage block falls down. Do you hit him? If you are a black NFL player, do you hit Colin Kaepernick and bring him down? Do you sack him, strip the ball, and try and run for that touchdown? Because if you do, and Kaepernick fails, then lo and behold, it's your fault. You want down with and oh no, this is football. This is competitive. People are expected to play to win. Are they? Have you seen what has now become unacceptable now? Do you want to be the NFL player? Do you want to be the black NFL player that causes Colin Kaepernick to fail? Do you want to be the defender who bats away that touchdown pass? Do you want to be the man who tackles him before he gets in the end zone? And especially if there's more than one person tackling him, do you want to be the person who potentially hurts Colin Kaepernick if he's signed? Have other players say, Cap, you don't think Black Lives Matter. You don't support Cap. Don't think for one moment you won't see that. You've seen Twitter. You've seen, and how soon will that happen? How quick will that happen? And I'm only talking about black players now. What if you're a white pass rusher? Are you going to hit Kaepernick and be he hit Kaepernick because what if he's slow to get up? Because he's a Trump supporter. He wants Kaepernick to fail. It gets even worse if you're on offense with him. What happens if you miss a block? He didn't miss that block because he missed the block. He didn't get driven off that line because of the defenders. He got driven off because he wasn't trying to help Cap. If you're a white guy and you miss the block or you don't catch the ball, you're trying to bring down Cap. You don't care that Black Lives Matter. You are on the other side. Every single play that he would be in would be scrutinized in that way. Every single moment on the practice field, every single time that he touches the ball and gets hit, or makes a pass and doesn't just throw it away poorly, is the potential for you to be blamed for his failure, for you to be canceled. Roger Goodell hasn't thought of it. Or maybe he has thought of it and doesn't care. And I suspect some NFL players have thought of that too. Now, there's actually some precedent for this. Joe Namath, late in his career, he had very bad knees. And there were guys who were a little easy on him late in his career because they knew he had bad knees and they knew that it was Namath's actions that helped start making the NFL players make a lot of money. What makes you think this isn't going to happen to Kaepernick? And how will it be if your team is the one letting him score? Think about this. You're going to be on this NFL player who Kaepernick is now going to be on the spot. Do you want that? Do you want that? I think question, and I think the NFL is going to need to answer it. And again, we're talking about this. The most amazing thing about all this is how bad it's gotten lately. And there's an example of this that happened in Boston recently. Now, our governor, Charlie Baker, just announced that we're going into our next phase. Starting next week, you're going to have some restaurants be able to have outside seating up to, I think, 50% capacity. People are going to have to jump through some hoops. I can't wait myself. But right now, we've already seen a situation which has gotten bad in a Boston restaurant. Fellow went to a Boston restaurant with some friends. And he started talking about Black Lives Matter. Came up in conversation because it's all of this is the conversation everywhere. Now, he didn't talk about how it's a fraud and a grift, like I say. He didn't talk about how it's a lie and how the only time a Black life matters is if that person's death can be used for political purposes. He didn't talk about all the money that's ended up going into Democrat campaigns from it either. What he suggested was, and this is just in conversation, that they would do better if there weren't violence going on. If they would just make their case. Peaceful protest would be better than violence. Well, apparently the person who was waiting the table overheard parts of the conversation going back and forth. And he was horrified. And he was so horrified that he posted it up on the internet and condemned this guy. Well, the owner of the restaurant fired him. Said, you can't be doing this. I mean, you can't be doing stuff like this. People expect to be able to, eat and not have their conversations, a private conversation at a restaurant, being reported on them. Well, as you might guess, it being Massachusetts, the outrage mob came from the restaurant. And in the end, what happened is the guy got his job back, and the person who went to that restaurant was banned permanently from it. So think about that. If you go to a restaurant, we have reached the point where people actually going to a restaurant who are having a conversation with other friends at that restaurant, bar and restaurant, have to word their servers reporting on their conversations if they're not pure enough. This is the point we've reached. Now, I haven't even talked about the police officer's mother who was fired from her job because of the charges against her son. And please don't tell me it's about something else. Don't insult my intelligence. Do not insult my intelligence by doing that. But if we've reached the point where if you're at a restaurant, you have to watch out what you say near the server because you're afraid the server might put it up on the net to attack you. That's pretty bad. Are you going to submit to that? Are you really going to submit to this without a fight? Is the ability to think and to express those thoughts aloud so unimportant that you're going to let this go? And I want to read you the story. I want to read the story proper. And this was Michael Graham, who is no longer here in Massachusetts. According to at least one New England restaurant, the answer is no. Here's the story in full. When you're out having drinks with friends, are your personal conversations about politics private? Should they be? According to at least one New England restaurant, the answer is no. And thus far, advocates for Black Lives Matter and other progressive political causes agree. Since the beginning of the protests following the George Floyd's death at the hands of Minneapolis police officer, what critics call cancel culture have been operating overtime. The premise of cancel culture is that people should be denied access to media platforms or publicly shamed into apologizing for expressing opinions unpopular with progressive acts. Happened to public figures like quarterback Drew Brees, who was pressured into apologizing by saying he disagreed with political protests by athletes that disrespected the American flag. It happened to the Philadelphia Museum of Art director Timothy Rubin, President Gail Harry, who, when they set off a staff email saying at this historic moment of anger and protest, it is vitally important to reaffirm that every individual life matters. And there have been multiple incidents of conservative public officials attempting to dine out. Senator Ted Cruz, former White House spokesman Sarah Sanders, being attacked or asked to leave by angry progressives. But what about being targeted for private conversations on a pitcher of beer and a plate of wings? On June 11th, Donald House and some friends dropped in the Mission on the Bay restaurant for some COVID-19 era outdoor dining. Massachusetts I told you about Massachusetts not allowing indoor dining yet. As House, a local select board member, recounted later, the conversation was typical after work fare, grousing about politics, the coronavirus lockdown, current events. At one, I shared my personal view that I believed rioting and looting was hurting the Black Lives Matter movement and its core message, House said. Enter Eric Heilman, a 20-something politically aware bartender. He overheard some of House's table talks. When he got off the clock, he promptly got on the internet to share it with the world. In a Facebook post, Heilman claimed House called the Black Lives Movement little bullshit and said white privilege isn't real. Overhearing these opinions left him distraught. I was working, so obviously I wasn't able to hear every word that was said. But every time I walked over, I was dumbfounded by the things I was hearing from people who just casually throw as if no one could hear them. House posted his own Facebook message denying Heilman's portrayal of the conversation, pointing out that the bartender was really by their table and expressing retreat that if the young man had a different opinion, he didn't say anything to House at the time. Now, when the story first broke, House was fired for violating the privacy of a restaurant patron. Quote, if you're here, you're in Switzerland, restaurant owner Monty Bloom said. People need confidentiality in our restaurant. Progressive supporting Heilman responded by besieging the restaurant with online posts and phone calls, denouncing management for silencing its staffer. After 2 days, the restaurant changed its tune. The decision to fire the bartender was a mistake, the restaurant said. Not only are they willing to rehire him, they told House he's no longer welcome to dine there. The activist bartender was offered his job back, and the customer who had his privacy violated is banned for life. So this is the future of America's nightlife. Cocktails, conversation, and political correctives. Not if Fred Yam, a Boston area board member of the U.S. Bartenders Guild, can help it. Great bartenders, in full disclosure, my father was one, are known for discretion and respect. Some of the famous bartenders in history never told a soul what their conversations were about. Jan told inside sources. One of my favorite instances was David Chan at Trader Vic's, who served many Navy grog to Richard Nixon during his presidency. Undoubtedly, Nixon revealed plenty of secrets and confidence to Chan. Chan never broke the bartender guest confidentiality. I do not believe vigilante justice has a place in hospitality, Jan said. Now, I wager there were a lot of people who called up that restaurant. Would you go there and eat? Would you go there? I think it's what's terrible is people are giving in. The restaurant should have told these people to go to hell. They should have declared the restaurant a safe space for the diners. But in the end, all the giving in to these people does is make them up their demands. That's all that happens. That's all that's going to come of it. So it's time to stand up. Am I ready to throw tables? No. But I do have this to say about the left. And that's this about the right. The right is very patient in one respect. Oh, hilarious. I just want to give this thought. This just came out with Twitter. The Oklahoma Supreme Court rejected a lawsuit from Stormy Daniels' lawyer challenging President Trump's Tulsa rally. Seriously? Seriously? This is how frivolous it's getting. This is how frivolous it's getting. And people aren't standing up. You need to stand up. You need to oppose these people. Because if we don't oppose them here, what's going to happen is eventually we're going to have to oppose them when they push too hard. And one thing about the right, they are very slow. Americans are very slow to go all in. But eventually they become Popeye. That's all I can stands. I can't stands no more. And if the American right decides to get into a fight, they're going to fight until there's no more reason to fight. They're not going to stop until the job is done. This is a ridiculous thing. We are at a time where we have peace and prosperity. Even with coronavirus, we're coming back. It's an amazing, amazing thing. It's an amazing, amazing thing. But if we let this happen, if we throw that away, the only fault will be. Well, that's the podcast. Hope you like it. Again, a little bit of house cleaning. Next week's podcast may or may not be live. I've got some vacation time I'm planning on spending. We're going to go out in search of pinball because I love pinball. We're going to do that. Second, if you like this podcast, please consider liking the video or subscribing. We don't have enough subscribers to get to the place where we can monetize it. Of course, given the content of the podcast, I'm sure YouTube will ban us the moment we reach a degree of monetizing. So forget monetizing it. If you like what you see, hit the tip jar. The whole point of the podcast was to traffic at the website and to raise about an extra $180 a month. This month, we've done not so good on the tip jar side, but our traffic is way up. So that helps. But either way, if you kick in or if you show up, or share the podcast. If you think what I'm saying is worthwhile. If you were an old listener of the Tech Guy on the radio when we were syndicated, or on a 50,000 watt station back when we were on CRN and other stations, and you think it's stuff that makes sense, share it with people and see what they think. I'm sure someone will come from me eventually. But it's one of the advantages of having a mediocre job and being old. I don't care. Let them come. We Sicilians are like that. I'll keep house if I have to. But whatever. Thanks for being here for the time you were here. Hope to see you next week. Hopefully live, possibly not. But next Friday at 3 o'clock, whether we're live or not, the podcast will be here. Rest of the day and have a fine weekend. That's all, folks. I think it's all, folks. If it'll shut itself off. There we go.